Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us here on NDTV. Thank you for your time. Having covered every aspect of this campaign in the aftermath of the Pahalgam terror attack, I can guarantee you, I can confirm to you that I haven't seen a piece more widely shared than the one that you've written on the RUSI website. So congratulations, first of all. And I think nobody is really surprised because it is perhaps the first independent take, one that doesn't appear to have an axe to grind. So I'm going to start, Professor, if you allow me, by quoting some of the things in your piece, and then I'm going to ask you those questions. Quote number 1, the strikes by the Indian Air Force against targets in Pakistan offer a powerful lesson in restraint, and Operation Sindoor adds a new approach to India's strategic toolbox. Professor Ladwig, how does Operation Sindoor, in your view, exemplify restraint in military strategy, and in what ways does it expand India's strategic options for future conflicts, in your view?
First, let me say thank you for having me on, and thank you for the very kind introduction and your words about the piece. I think there's a couple of really notable elements that we've seen here. One, of course, with respect to restraint, is the fact that on night 1, as far as we can determine, the operational rules of engagement given to the Indian Air Force were to focus solely on striking the targets related to terrorist infrastructure, not to provoke an engagement with the Pakistani military. And that came with it extremely elevated operational risks for the pilots undertaking this mission, and perhaps is linked to the allegations of that some jets were shot down or damaged on night 1. So that is the restraint portion, and it's no small thing, you know. It might be easier for politicians to kind of give such commands, but for the actual individual who has to hold their nerve and follow orders with enemy aircraft in the air, we shouldn't underestimate how demanding that is. With respect to the range of options, I mean, we see strikes now that have expanded beyond simply Pakistan, Kashmir. You know, in 2019, Balakot is, you know, it is in KPK, but realistically, it's just barely across the border. And we're now talking about expanding into Punjab proper, kind of the strategic and cultural heartland. And the range of assets we saw employed, particularly the use of loitering munitions, you know, so-called suicide drones, which, you know, the Indian Air Force is basically imparting a technique and an approach that we've seen in other conflict theaters. So Azerbaijan, Armenia conflict, some of the Middle East conflicts, but the very first time this technology has been employed, and from what we can see, employed to great effect.
You also say, Professor, in this piece, and I quote again, in any military campaign, shaping the strategic narrative is nearly as important as shaping the battle space. Unfortunately, India ceded that narrative space. And I can tell you here in India, there have been a lot of fights over this whole narrative battle, as it were, because, you know, we've seen the visible proof of what this military campaign actually did in Pakistan at all those bases and those terror sites. But your view on the narrative battle, what were the consequences, according to you, of India ceding this strategic narrative during Operation Sindoor, and how might this impact its deterrence capability?
Well, the story that unfolded on night 1 was not one widespread, I should say, of the ability to precisely strike infrastructure, the ability to carry out these operations in the face of what appeared to be at the time a reasonably credible air defense system. It was the allegation that one or more aircraft may have been shot down, and the lack of confirmation, the sort of refusal to engage or discuss on the part of Indian military spokespeople, as I write in the piece, creates a vacuum that allowed all sorts of commentators, some who are credible, some who seem to have a Twitter account and an internet feed and no more knowledge backing them up, to go crazy with their narratives. And again, then this was picked up by the international media, which turned it into a story of French jets versus Chinese jets, totally devoid of the context in which operations were taking place, totally devoid of any kind of discussion about what India may have achieved in the course of this. And it really took on a life of its own. And to be perfectly blunt with you and your audience, it was this point that led me to write this paper in the first place, because I felt that the conversations and the discussions that I was seeing in London and elsewhere were not related to what I saw as the big picture or the important aspect of this operation.
And I'm really glad you did, Professor, because I can tell you, being in the middle of it, and I've just returned from Kashmir, it was difficult to zoom out from all of those little tactical aspects of the battle space and the fog of war, which we still currently are in. But another thing you say, which is related in this piece, is, and I quote, "Rather than serious analysis of India's targeting methodology, command intent, like you just referred to, or escalation thresholds, coverage focused instead on the air-to-air engagement that led to the loss of Indian aircraft." In your view, once again, this is valuable because you are zoomed out, you're on the outside looking in. How do you think the media's focus, or social media's focus, or the seeded narrative arena, as it were, how do you think this overshadowed the broader strategic objectives of Sindoor?
Well, again, if you go back and look at all of the coverage that emerged around the world, it was questions about, is this a deep-seek moment for Chinese aircraft? Do Chinese missiles have the edge over French or European or Western? What are the implications of this for the defense of Taiwan? Does this mean now that Taiwan is undefendable because these aircraft will be in the air and they manage to, possibly bring down a Rafale or other frontline Russian fighters? And again, and I'm glad you cited the fog of war, because this is another really key point. We will have answers to a lot of our questions, but it probably won't be for months, right? Analysts and observers like yourself will be picking over the details of this for some time to come, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions, at some point in the future.
Yes.
But trying to make a snap judgment on the basis of incomplete information and then extrapolating it to a whole range of other scenarios, that's not the way serious work gets done.
Very true. And in the first few days, as a result of the huge amount of misinformation and half information, as it were, especially from Pakistan's side, it seems like a lot of the fog really only thickened, and there wasn't clarity until a few days later, when the Indian military conducted very detailed briefings, which brought that first layer of clarity. Professor, quote number 4, the highlight that I'd like to read out now, is one of the most interesting ones, and I imagine this is the one that people are going to pick up and take away with them, which is, quote, "Despite Pakistani tactical successes, India appears to have largely achieved its stated objectives." In your view, Professor, what were India's stated objectives? And I'm asking because we want to get this absolutely clear. It's rare to get an independent view. How were they achieved despite facing these tactical setbacks, in your understanding?
So the stated objectives were to inflict punishment and degrade the infrastructure that exists within parts of Pakistan connected to cross-border terrorism.
Yeah.
Not to provoke a general conflict or a wider set of engagements with the Pakistani military. Beyond that, then, once the sort of tit-for-tat cycle began, there was a desire to show and demonstrate an ability to strike and to do more than just demonstrate an ability to hit terrorist infrastructure, but to have an ability to sort of show a degree of escalation dominance. But I think that it's really important then for understanding, because I know some in your viewership might then raise questions about why the government, stopped when it did. And it gets back to what was the mission in the first place. Yeah. The mission in the first place was about terrorist infrastructure. It was not about provoking a broader conflict. And those were the mission orders given to the military. The prime minister, I think, has been very clear and very specific in his language about what the intent was. And I think they've met what they've said they set out to do.
So your assessment, just to be clear, Professor, would be that given the terms of reference, if I can use that phrase, for what the military was ordered to achieve, that so-called operational freedom, your assessment would be they did the maximum that they could within that window?
I think they achieved what they set out to do.
Yeah.
Right. The question of what will be the long-term deterrent effect? Will this lead to various groups or the elements of the Pakistani state that might work from them from changing their minds and behaviors? I mean, these are things that we'll only be able to observe and assess over time.
Okay. Quote number 5 from your piece, Professor. Quote, operations expanded in scope, penetrating Pakistan's Chinese-supplied air defense network to target select forward air bases for the first time since the 1971 war, unquote. Professor, what is the strategic significance? Again, I want it broken down because we don't want to get this wrong. What is the strategic significance, in your view, of India targeting Pakistani forward air bases in a non-war scenario? And how does this action compare to past military engagements between the two nations, in your view?
Well, first of all, it demonstrates the range of capabilities that the Indian Air Force has built up over the last decade, because we already talked about the addition of loitering munitions to the arsenal, long-range precision, sort of standoff strike capabilities, largely French provided, that have been added to the arsenal and appeared to have worked with great effect. And the ability to, again, operate in the space and in the face of what on paper is a credible air defense network.
Yeah.
You know, this is not third-rate technology that the Pakistani Air Force has. It is good Chinese material, and so the ability to execute those to effect across a range of targets in a very short period of time demonstrates a kind of a very significant operational capability. And this also means we are in very, I might say, sort of undiscovered country when it comes to military operations. And I'm going to put my academic hat on for a moment and say, in the context of the nuclear era, we do not have an example of two nuclear armed states who've engaged in reciprocal airstrikes like this at all. Right? And 2019 was seen to be a bit of a watershed moment, and that was very carefully calibrated and carefully orchestrated. We don't have this. The Russians and the Chinese did fight in the late 1960s, but this was on the ground, and in some cases, the combatants were carrying clubs precisely because they were concerned about escalation. So this is really new space, and I think, going to your question about implications, I mean, academics like me and my colleagues who are specialists in nuclear weapons are going to probably be studying this for decades to come.
I believe that entirely, Professor. And the Indian Prime Minister, no doubt you've already heard him say multiple times, you know, that the nuclear bluff has been called and that India is not going to, be vulnerable to nuclear blackmail anymore, which leads to the sixth highlight that I want to pull out from your piece, which is India now appears less willing to maintain that distinction, the distinction, between terror and the military or state-owned assets. In effect, future terror attacks or terrorist attacks may be treated as the initiation of conventional hostilities. That's very specific. In your view, Professor, once again, how does this switch in India's approach of treating terrorist attacks as conventional hostilities or act of war, as the government says, after the, how does this alter the dynamics of our deterrence strategy with Pakistan? In many ways, Operation Sindoor was a demonstration of that.
So I see it as an evolution in the government's policies. If we go back to 2016 and the surgical strikes, were a change in approach in the sense of these sort of cross-border raids happened in the past, but they were never publicized. They were never made so public. And then the 2019 airstrikes in Balakot really was seen to be a break from past precedent, because this was not operations in Kashmir, which I think, there was a sense that the two sides saw Kashmir as different, right? But carrying an operation into a country proper was a entirely different animal, and those that was carried out. And now you have a next level, which is to say multiple targets being struck in multiple rounds across a much broader swath of the country. And linked to that, the policy change of not ahead of time feeling the need to assemble the dossier, connect the dots, to sort of say that it's incumbent on India to prove, in a courtroom sense or beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that there are these connections, and instead to try to change the equation and say the onus is now actually on the other side. If you fail to rein these groups in, if you fail to deny them space to operate, then that is enough. That is probable cause of collusion, and will decide that we may take serious action.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Professor, because that's precisely what my seventh highlight from your piece is, and I'll quote that again. India no longer accepts that the burden of proof lies with them, or that they must produce evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to establish the Pakistani state's complicity. Again, very specific. So my question to you is, what are the implications of India shifting the burden of proof regarding Pakistan's complicity in terrorist activities, and how might this affect international diplomatic relations? We've seen that particularly become a flashpoint, not just this time, but during Balakot, during the surgical strikes as well. What about now, Professor?
I do think it's something that the Indian government needs to keep in mind, and the fact that they've sort of, and the Prime Minister's words have suggested that the burden of proof will not rest with India, at the same time doesn't mean that they should not attempt to make a credible case to international audiences. I think what we saw in the immediate aftermath of the terror attack was an outpouring of sort of sympathy and solidarity for India. Although, a number of India's partners at times might have publicly defaulted to a bit of the old, we call on both sides to be restrained.
Yep.
In private, there were messages of support, understanding, we understand you need to do what you need to do. And so I think there is, in the present moment and based on recent history, I think that India has the benefit of the doubt from its partners, but they shouldn't take that for granted. And I say this as an American whose governments over time have probably abused the trust of their partners, that because the government does not feel the burden of proof necessarily lies with them, doesn't mean they shouldn't do the best job possible to make the case and demonstrate that they are right. Because, if this were to sort of escalate significantly, people might start to point fingers. And so they need to kind of do that narrative campaign alongside the military campaign.
And I'm very glad you're telling it like it is, Professor, because I can guarantee you that people are listening right now. And at the cost of repeating myself, it is refreshing to hear someone say it without any of the usual embellishments or one-sidedness that we've been hearing from either the other side or this side. But my eighth quote, as we come towards the end of this interview, where you say, rather than treating terrorism as a separate challenge, India is increasingly framing it within the logic of state-to-state deterrence. That, once again, Professor, is something that was, on day 2 and day 3 of Operation Sindoor, demonstrated militarily. In what ways, in your view, does integrating counter-terrorism within state-to-state deterrence frameworks enhance or complicate India's national security policy? It's a broad question, but I still want to know your view. Yeah.
So I think I'll answer in both directions. So I think it does enhance in the sense that one of the things that I think has frustrated a succession of Indian governments was the sort of plausible deniability of intelligence agencies supporting terrorist groups. And there are always questions about what are the exact links. How much command and control is there? Can we definitely demonstrate that there's some handler with a radio who's directing these people to carry out their operations? Are there real fingerprints? Can money be shown? Can arms be shown to be linked back?
Yeah.
And so by saying that we see this as the actions of state actors, we're not going to, again, get dug down into those details. We are going to say there's a deterrence posture. Anything that happens here will be met with a response. I think where you get into an area of risk, and I do talk about it at the tail end of the article, is twofold. One is to say you can't make your response so mechanistic that there's no judgment left for the decision makers at the top. Yeah. Because on the one hand, there might be cases in which non-state actors and terrorist groups seek to provoke precisely because they want to trigger a broader conflagration, and it might be their agenda to even necessarily provoke an overreaction, which is, to be quite frank, a well-worn terrorist tactic to discredit particularly kind of democratic states. So there needs to still be a degree of discretion held by decision makers. And then the other thing is, this is going to turn into a bit of an intelligence cat and mouse game.
Yes.
Because after a strike, the smart terrorists, even those, one group may have carried something out, anyone else with sense is going to go to ground the second a big thing happens. They're not going to be sitting around in known facilities waiting for retaliation. And so the ability to track and monitor and know precisely where the pain points are going to become ever harder with each sort of iteration, because groups are going to spend a lot more time on concealment. They're going to spend a lot more time on covering their tracks. And that's going to put the job on the sort of intelligence targeting side, make it much more difficult.
Professor Ladwig, this has been extremely illuminating. I did have a couple more questions, but I think you've covered most of them in your answers. So I'm going to end this interview with my final quote from your piece, which says, Operation Sindoor should be viewed as a recalibration aimed at restoring deterrence, clarifying escalation thresholds, and reinforcing the consequences of inaction. That couldn't have said it better. And I thank you once again for your wisdom, for sharing your insights and your thoughts. Like I said, and I repeat, it's rare to see an independent view that doesn't have an axe to grind and gives us a view from the outside in, because I can tell you Operation Sindoor has been over for a couple of weeks now. Well, it's not over, it's paused, as the Prime Minister reminds us. But as you said, I think academics, scholars, observers are going to be picking through the incomplete pieces of this operation for many, many weeks to come. Professor Walter Ladwig, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time here on NDTV.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.